Okay, welcome everyone to today's presentation. I was just reading a comment from Anthony saying RPI is a strong chess team. There you go, David. Welcome to today's event on digital strategy, cloud, and the impact to service management. I'm excited to announce our speaker today, someone that I'm proud to call a friend, David Cannon. He's Executive VP for a consultant company called Nfinity3. You can find out more about them by visiting their website. David also can be seen everywhere from featured speaker at numerous conferences or in his words through the many books he's authored, including the ITIL 4 books, Digital and IT Strategy, and Acquiring and Managing Cloud Services. I had the privilege of meeting David while participating in the ITIL 4 working group. And if you're on the call that are part of the ITIL 4 working group, shout out to you. We were reviewing the then draft versions of both books, and that's had a chance to meet David and work with him on those. To enhance your knowledge about what you learned today, I would encourage you to pick up a copy of both books. So the format of today's presentation is going to go as the following. It'll last about 40-45 minutes with time left over at Q&A. Everyone will be on mute, but feel free to post your question in the Q&A window. We will address them as they come in, and we'll save the rest for the end. If we don't get to your question, we will provide a written response as part of the event recording. If you want to speak, use the raise hand function so I can take you off mute. We're at about 60 people, so it might be a little hard to manage that logistically, but if you do want to say something, use the raise hand function and I'll take you off mute. Other than that, use the chat window to talk to each other. We encourage that. Have a conversation. Side conversation is totally fine. So encourage you to chat for side conversation, but please use the Q&A window to ask your questions. The webinar is being recorded and will be available on the EDUCAUSE ITSM website within 5 business days. So without further ado, I will turn it over to David.
Thanks very much, Mitch, and it's really good to be back again. I think as part of the ITIL projects that I've been involved in, EDUCAUSE has played a really important role as providing input into the books as well as feedback on things that we wrote. And it's really just good to be part of this meeting. And again, many of you have seen the slides already and have had a chance to provide input, and I found that extremely valuable. Just wanted to say thank you for that. And I'll talk a little bit more about some of the input that we've had and some of the exchanges that we've had with EDUCAUSE over the course of writing these books. But let's get straight into the material because we have quite a bit to get through. This is not a simple subject. There is quite a lot involved, and I've tried to highlight some of the more important areas and really focus in on those. You will have a copy of the slides sent to you. So you'll be able to reference a lot of the small text in the slides, some of the details in the slides as well. I'm going to also give you my contact details at the end, and please, by all means, reach out to me on LinkedIn or by email if you have questions or if you just like to connect or have a discussion. Always happy to do that. So let's dive into the slides. And the title that we came up with was Service Management Despite Digital Disruption. The idea was that many service management programs are really going through some turbulent times because of the changes that are happening in the organization through the use of digital technologies. And many of these technologies not coming from inside IT, but actually coming from from the broader context, and especially cloud service providers working directly with faculties, with administration, and so on. So we found a lot of groups were really struggling to make sense of how do my traditional or my, the hard work that I've put into defining these service management programs and processes and so on, how do I make sure that we continue to be effective as things are changing around us, as decision-making and authorities start shifting around the organization? How do we deal with this? And I actually thought, that seems almost a negative statement, despite a digital disruption. In fact, what what I really believe is that service management is one of the keys to being able to master digital disruption. I don't think that it's possible to respond to the disruptiveness that's happening in the industry right now without having an effective service management program. So the whole purpose of this presentation is how do we really champion the role of service management within a very rapidly and volatilely changing environment. So before we get started, let's just recognize the fact that there are many different types of digital disruptors, right? There is artificial intelligence and machine learning. There is this whole remote learning types of platforms and collaboration platforms, et cetera, et cetera. However, because of the work that I've been involved in recently, we're really just going to focus in on one type of disruptive technology, and that is the cloud. And of course, the cloud includes a number of the other areas that I've just spoken about. But we're going to look at that type of technology and the way in which it's disrupting organizations. So we're going to look at what are the benefits of the cloud, and how ITSM specifically can help organizations to achieve those benefits.
Hey, David, sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
Are you sharing a presentation, or do you have a presentation you want to share? Or?
Thank you for that.
No problem. Now, let me know if you have trouble
I'm
sharing.
going along and saying, this is fantastic. It's going so well.
You're not just teeing us up. Yeah, you're just teeing us up. So.
I've gone through about 4 slides already. I do apologize.
No,
so
okay.
let me get that back up. Thanks, Mitch. So yeah, there we go. So we have service management, which is mastering. It's the key, one of the keys to mastering digital disruption. And I then got to the slide over here. So we're going to look at the benefits of cloud. And one of the things that that became very clear as we were doing a lot of research around the cloud and how it was being managed is that it is a technology that is being broadly adopted, but only a third of organizations are actually achieving what they thought they should achieve when they moved to cloud. So if they thought they were going to achieve cost savings, only a third of them actually achieved their targeted cost savings. If they thought they were going to have greater speed to market, in other words, the ability to develop new curricula, for example, new programs, and being able to get that out to the market really quickly, we found again, only a third of organizations, or just under a third of organizations, actually managed to achieve the anticipated speed to market. The same was true of service levels. So a lot of organizations were saying, well, we're moving to the cloud because we get better service from cloud services than we do from our on-premise technologies. Again, less than a third of organizations actually achieved the anticipated improvement in those benefits. So, and in all cases, ITSM has a very important role to play in fixing that issue. So I'm going to talk a little bit about those. We're going to look at the challenges. Why do so many organizations have difficulty in achieving those, and what can we do about it? And then I would also like to look at not just how is business being disrupted by these technologies. I'm also going to look at how we as our own ITSM programs are being disrupted. Now, when I talk about ITSM, I'm not going to talk about a specific framework. The material that I'm using is based largely on the ITIL 4 Acquiring and Managing Cloud Services book, but it recognizes the fact that a modern service management program deals with all kinds of frameworks. It's not just an ITIL based program, although that is very important, but we also have a lot of agile methodologies coming in. We have DevOps coming in, and we have a number of other approaches that we're now dealing with, because these technologies, which before were quite separate, and you could have one group using one methodology or one framework to use their technology and another group using another one to manage their technology, in the digital environment, they all kind of come together. So I'm not going to talk about only one, and I'm not going to reference the core practices of any one framework. We're service managers. We know what the frameworks are, and we understand the kind of practices that we need to be using. I'm going to cover the type of practices we need to be using, but I'm not going to really say, well, for this practice, you need to use this framework because it's the only right one, because that's simply not true. Okay. Another thing before we really get started is the nature of disruption, of digital disruption. And this is important to recognize that some disruptions are temporary. So we get disrupted, and the aim in that disrupted situation is to return to normal as soon as possible. We had this situation with a pandemic. Now, it wasn't a digital disruption. It was, it was clearly a pandemic. It was of a health nature. But in that disrupted environment, we needed to get back to normal as soon as possible. And other disruptions, examples of this kind of disruptions are security breaches or ransomware attacks. They're disruptive, but they're disrupted in an extremely negative way. And we have to try and get back to normal as soon as possible. I'm not going to be talking too much about those types of disruptions. I'm going to be talking about the kind of disruptions that are permanent. The fact that we now have opened this, I don't know if we want to call it a Pandora's box, but we've certainly opened this, this door to the opportunities of remote learning, for example. Remote learning, it's been around for a while, but during the pandemic became a really important cornerstone of our strategies in higher ed. It's not temporary, it's not going back, it is going to be with us. And in fact, not only is it, I'm not saying that in a negative way, the positive side of that is that many of us are now going to be able to offer programs that we were not able to offer before. We're going to be able to change the business models of our higher education institution. We're going to be able to attract a broader range of students, broader range of degrees and certification programs. And the fact that this digital disruption is not temporary, that it is permanent, is really good news for us. But it is going to require us to change the way that we work. The next thing there is that digital disruption is a moving target. You don't just get disrupted and then everything settles back to normal and you continue on with life in the new way. You get disrupted and then suddenly you make the changes, you've adopted this new technology, you're just getting used to it and something else comes along. That's kind of the phase that we're in right now. And our industry is being disrupted several times a year. Now, some of them are major disruptions, but most of them are smaller kinds of disruptions. So they relate to an individual part of our organization or an individual process that we're working with or an individual solution that we're working with. But nonetheless, they're disruptive and they do require us to change the way that we work in order to accommodate them and start using them and benefiting from them. So our role, and this is the important footnote here, our role as service managers is to equip organizations to thrive through constant evolution. So as the disruptive technology comes along, as society, as our student bodies, as our faculties get disrupted by whatever's happening, whatever's coming along, it's our job to try, or not only to try, but to work with them to make sure that they are growing through that those disruptive changes. So I'm going to put that out there, and we'll come back to that. The goal of this presentation is to try and figure out exactly how we do that. So let's have a look at the agenda now. Now that's sort of the preamble. It's a very important preamble, by the way. It's important to recognize the nature of digital disruption. That being said, what is the cloud? What are the promises of cloud and how does ITSM achieve them? And then third, what are the challenges of cloud and how does ITSM help to overcome them? And then fourth, what I wanted to do was to give an idea of maybe 3 or 4 things that everybody attending this call could go out and start thinking about doing, right? Okay, what are the tangible steps that I can take to build on what we covered in this presentation? So That's the fourth point there. All right, so what is the cloud? And here are some definitions. And by the way, I also went back through the EDUCAUSE definition of cloud and made sure that it's consistent with that. The first thing about cloud that is really important to recognize is that it is pools of shared computing resources. A lot of people, when they talk about cloud, they think of cloud architecture. Oh, we're using Kubernetes, so we've got cloud. No, actually, the purpose of cloud is, and the reason why it is so ubiquitous, is the fact that cloud service providers have found a way to take technology, commoditize and standardize it, and then use it to provide services to hundreds of customers. That way they can keep the cost down, and they can make those services very cost effective to you. What do you sacrifice when you do that? Well, you sacrifice the custom experience. You sacrifice the things that are unique to your organization because you're now using shared resources that sit within someone else's data center. The access is ubiquitous, which means you can access it from anywhere, whether you're internet, whether you're using it through a dedicated link, but you can get it from home, from a hotel, from the office. It is on demand, and that's very important, and a key aspect to managing cloud services is that it is on demand. Now, what they don't say in that little word there is that it is pay per use. And this is one of the key stumbling blocks. One of the big stumbling blocks of cloud is that we are accustomed to being in an environment where we have spare capacity for everything that we do. So we utilize whatever we have. Let's say it's a server farm. We utilize it at 60 to 80%. When it gets to 80%, we start adding more servers in there. Right? We don't ever want to get below or above 80%. And that way we can accommodate peak demands and this kind of thing. Of course, the downside of that is that you've invested in this extra capacity. But when you move to the cloud, there's no spare capacity, right? If you want to use something, you pay for it. And that's very difficult for people to get used to when they're used to just doing whatever they want and it'll be covered. I'll give you an example of this. I was working with a medical research facility, and the scientists were complaining that that storage costs were really high. And they went to IT and said, we've done some research. We've had a look at the various storage offerings from, AWS, Google, Azure, and so on and so forth. And we've noticed that we can save as much as 90% or 80% on the cost of storage by, per cost of gigabyte. And the IT department says, well, okay, you're the customer. You get to decide what you use. And if it can truly save costs, that's fine. 2 years later, their storage costs had multiplied 3 times what they were paying before. Why? Because storage is much cheaper. Well, what was happening is that the perception was that this device or this service is so cheap, we can just use it. So instead of, whereas before storage was limited by the IT budget, we had to rely on archiving old data. We never duplicated data. We differentiated between real-time online processed data versus data that was stored on a slower retrieval system. Well, now because the perception is storage is cheap, we can use as much as we like. Data was being duplicated. Multiple versions of the data were being kept. There was no archiving. It was all kept on real-time retrieval. And so, of course, that's gonna spiral the cost of storage out of control. So this idea that it's not a free resource, you pay for every single thing that you use in the cloud is an idea that can be very difficult for people to get used to when they've had almost unlimited or seemingly unlimited resources in their data center. It's self-service. And that's really great because people can get what they need when they need it. At the same time, it's self-service. So there is a possibility of being able to acquire cloud services without any kind of centralized control. And very often early adopters of cloud services soon experienced this thing called cloud sprawl, which meant that everybody and anybody was onboarding cloud services using their company credit card or their departmental budget without any kind of compliance to any centralized standard or without any kind of access control. So there, no, I would say any kind of access control, of course, was controlled by the departments involved. But what they were finding is that there was a lot of duplication happening because every department would go and buy what they needed without realizing that other departments were buying the same thing. And organizations start losing out on valuable discount structures and so on and so forth. So self-service, double-edged sword, once again. It is elastic and scalable, which means that it's very easy to deal with peak demand and troughs in the demand. I'll talk about the structure in a moment. But it's structured as infrastructure, platform, or software services. There are a number of other types of cloud which people talk about. You know, functionality as a service is an example. In fact, it became so many of these things that the term was coined XaaS, anything or everything as a service. It's a little bit misleading, because usually what you find is that those things fit into either an infrastructure, a platform, or a software type of architecture. So we've decided really to stick with the three. It just makes it easier to kind of talk about them. And then once you've got that, you can then subcategorize them into different subsets. So for example, in infrastructure, we can talk about storage as a service. And we would typically view that as an infrastructure as a service subcategory. But it complies to the general guidelines for infrastructure as a service. It can be consumed as public, community, or private services, or a hybrid of these. Now, I know that that higher ed really, the community-based cloud service is extremely important, especially when sharing intellectual property and research and that kind of thing. That becomes really important. And I would say it's that probably the higher ed community is one where community-based cloud services are probably most used between higher ed and probably certain government sectors. Outside of that, you don't often hear about. In commercial sense, you don't often hear about community-based cloud models. So usually we talk about public or private. And the thing about private is it's not truly cloud specifically, because basically what you've done is you've taken your services, you've architected them using some sort of cloud architecture, and then you've outsourced them to a provider. But there is a one-to-one relationship between you and that provider. So it's kind of cloud, but it's also kind of not cloud, because you do not have those pools of shared resources. It's a one-to-one relationship. So it's more like an outsourcing relationship than a cloud relationship, even though the architecture is cloud-based. But anyway, that is not too critical for this presentation. We can probably argue that point, but it's not going to add any value to what we're discussing today. The final point on this, which I thought was important, is that we consume cloud in the form of services, not products. Now, this is important because as we move into the digital transformation and digital management, you will hear a lot of people talking about the importance of products as the unit of work that gets worked on. And when you talk about products, we tend to use very manufacturing-based type management methodologies. Cloud is consumed as services, not products. We use the cloud to develop products. And so the cloud is very important in product management, but the services themselves are not products. They are actually services. And what I mean by that is that they're volatile, they're on demand, they're dynamic. You can never tell, what cloud services you're going to use one day versus the next day. It all depends on what's happening in the environment. Clue: to be very successful at managing cloud services, you have to understand the environment in which those services are being used so that you can understand what the demand is going to be and how best to meet that demand. And that demand changes. It's dynamic. It changes all the time. So part of our approach, this is why service management is such an important part of managing cloud services. Yes, products are important, but when it comes to managing cloud services, it's the service management components that really help us to set good management strategies for cloud services. So I just want to point out here, another misconception about cloud is that organizations that use the cloud are using it because the cloud is highly innovative. It is true that cloud service providers are very innovative organizations. I mean, just to do what they've done takes a lot of innovation. However, Kevin, sorry, before I move on to the slide, is there confusion between product and a service? Depending on where you work, yes, there can be. We're doing some work in, or at least a colleague of mine is doing some work in London at one of the universities there. And one of the biggest issues they have is you have one part of the organization using the language of product and product management, and another part of the organization using the language of services and service management. And they're really struggling on how to position the two against each other. So do services help you to create products and deliver products, or are products the basis for you to be able to deliver services, or is it both? And in that case, when do you use which methodologies as your primary methodology? So I would say, you know, if you do not have that confusion in your organization, that's great, because you've really started working on this, and many organizations have. But there are still a lot of organizations that are struggling with this this confusion between product and service. So, great. Mitch has just responded there. So Kevin, it looks like you're up for a presentation coming up soon. I think that'll be good. So this part of cloud services is significant. We talk about cloud services being innovative, but in reality, the cloud services themselves are really not, they're not the innovative pieces. And let me be very careful about what I say here, because of course there are a number of components of cloud that are very innovative. So for example, there are artificial intelligence laboratories which you can use that are provided by organizations. In fact, all of the cloud service providers have something along those lines that you can use. And those are clearly very innovative. But that's only 2% of cloud usage. In fact, even smaller than that. The 98% plus of cloud utilization is not used because people are looking for innovation. They're used because people are looking for a cheaper way to find commoditized solutions. So innovation happens, and we use the example of servers, for example, back in the 80s, even before that, but 80s, 90s definitely. And even into the 2000s, the kind of server you had was really important. Companies like HP and Sun and so on spent a lot of research money on innovating the type of servers they had. But over time, we got used to managing servers as really just a commodity component. You know, everybody started using servers, and we were using them in very similar ways. So we got used to understanding how to operate servers, and soon we have server farms with multiple different types of servers. So we get very good at operating this. Well, before you know it, everybody is managing servers. And what starts to happen is service providers start becoming really good at managing servers for the lowest possible price. It becomes a commodity. And the thing with a commodity is that it is a very easy thing to outsource, because it is cheaper to get it from someone who specializes in that area than to spend the money on all of the resources to be able to keep that capability in-house. The sourcing of many of these things is found in the cloud. And so what we're sourcing from the cloud in most cases are commoditized components. These are virtual servers. The software that we use is software that is automated processes that have been around for decades. You do not find cutting edge software as a service, generally speaking, at least not in the mainstream. There are not a lot of cutting edge software that's available as SaaS in the cloud. And that's because you want hundreds of users to use one common set of functionality. So the kinds of software as a service generally tend to be those pieces of software that have been commoditized, things like enterprise resource management, things like ITSM, incident problem and change management, and so on. Things that have been around, that we've been working on for at least the last 3 decades. Right. So I want to get through some more slides here. Of course, the one important thing about this is cloud does fuel innovation because it creates building blocks which I can now use to do business differently. So yes, I've now used commoditized servers in the cloud, but because I'm doing that, it means I can give access to people that I was not previously able to reach to the services that I provide. So I can be a very small organization, but I can have an international footprint because I'm able to extend my reach to customers that are not in my geographical location. So we can be very innovative using the cloud, but the cloud itself consists of very commoditized and standardized components, again, in most cases. Right. Now, here's another key point to remember, is that the cloud is not just one thing, right? It's not, you don't just have the cloud and everybody uses it in the same way. What we discovered is there were 2 different variables that we really needed to focus on before we did anything else. And that was different people use cloud differently. And there were so many different use cases, we couldn't document them all. But what we did notice is that they fitted onto this continuum. So on the one end, we have highly standardized, commoditized use of cloud. For example, we have an organization that has a server farm. They find it cheaper and easier to put that server farm in the cloud, use virtual server technology. It's cheaper, it's quicker, it's easier, but the end user doesn't really notice any difference at all. So it's standardized, it's commoditized. We just take what we're doing in the IT department, we move it into the cloud. Lift and shift. On the other hand, we have organizations that are taking the cloud and doing very innovative things with it. Again, like creating new business models, remote learning, for example, digital medicine. So they're standardized components, but they're used in highly innovative ways. So, and here's the problem. Both of these groups, or all of the groups on this continuum, work in the same organization. It's not like you have one organization focusing on standardized and a completely different organization focusing on emerging. In the same organizations, you have these groups using the cloud in these different ways. The second variable was, how do we manage cloud? And again, we saw so many different use cases, but they tended to vary from, on the one extreme, we had heavily centralized control. On the other extreme, we have very decentralized, where everybody is able to decide their own way of using cloud and managing the cloud, and who we provide access to, how decisions are made. And what we then did, because a lot of us are consultants, and when you're a consultant, whenever you see continua like this or spectrums, what you can do is you can tilt one on the side and create some magic quadrants. So that's what we did. It's a very nifty little consultant trick, which you can use to impress far and wide. Just a little bit of added value I want to give in the presentation. But here you have the quadrants. And if you look at those quadrants, you'll see that there are 4 distinct groups of use and management of cloud. So the first one, we have standard components. There is centralized control, like-for-like replacement. We use these for modernization programs. And an example of that is, as I've said, we're moving the server farm from the data center to the cloud. Very centralized, very standardized. Group 2 is where IT acts as a broker for standardized offerings. So you have the standardized components, but you have freedom of choice in the business units as to which of those technologies they're going to procure. And so IT acts as a broker, and typically what they do is they negotiate a range of cloud services from a number of providers. They negotiate the pricing, and then they stage that for the business units to select which services they need. This is typically used in government organizations, especially. where there is just a huge organization with a number of varying use cases. For example, the example I've used there is IT negotiates a storage service, but it's up to the users to decide how they use that storage service, how they apply data governance, and so on and so forth. The third group is where you have centralized control, but you're working on something very innovative. And this is typically found in research departments or in laboratories where you're trying out new solutions. For example, you may have a working group that says, we've got to find a way of providing fresh and exciting lectures using video conferencing. Here's a few options. Let's experiment with them. And so we create this lab environment or this garage environment, and we have people from various business units, people from IT, people from administration, and they all come in there and they figure out how they're going to make this work and what they're going to do with this technology. So there you go. IT and administration create a lab to find a new online enrollment solution. There's an example of group 3. And then group 4, this is potentially the best and the worst, right? It can be the worst if by this we mean that we don't care what people do with the cloud. We just give it over to them and they can do whatever they like. And before you know it, you have this duplication and overspending on cloud because there is just absolutely no control. And on top of that, it is highly insecure because there are inconsistent security controls being applied. In the best case of this, what tends to happen here is that we have a use case that is so unique that it offers us a new business opportunity, which will not work unless we do something dramatically different. And so what we want to do here is we want to spin off maybe a new business opportunity. For example, hey, maybe we can start providing online degrees to complement our on-site degrees, using even a new operating model and a new brand to reach more students. So, that could be an example of how we use model 4. The point for ITSM is that it is really important for us to understand which model is being used whenever we're trying to figure out how this cloud service needs to be managed. And the way in which we define our service catalogs and our support models will strongly depend on what kind of model is being used for the cloud service. Now, I'm going to look at the promises of cloud, and I'm going to move pretty quickly here. A lot of these slides I'm not going to cover in detail. I really just want to point out to you, and I'm going to point out an interesting shift that's happening. So cost reduction, it happens in cloud because we're not spending on excess capacity. We're only paying for the features we use, and we achieve economies of scale by using pooled resources. The additional thing is cloud services are very resilient. And so we do not have to pay for these very expensive redundant systems. Those are already built into the cloud architecture. And also because delivering commodities can be very costly when they're very inexpensive from outside the organization. Of course, the downside of this is if you start moving to the cloud, as I pointed out before, and you use those services in a completely different way, and you're using them with different workloads, then it becomes real problematic and your costs will not go down. Cost reduction happens when there is a like-for-like performance of workloads from in-house to in the cloud. Where you start adding to workloads just because you moved into the cloud, that is where your costs start going up, because everything you do comes with a price tag. So how does ITSM support cost reduction? 4 main areas, but they're not the only ones, but certainly here's some examples. Financial management to be able to quantify the cost and track it. Capacity management to understand what utilization is going to happen. So if we can forecast what the demand for cloud services is going to be, we can forecast how much we're going to pay for them. We won't get caught by surprise expenditure. Availability management. Here's an example, a banking organization that we worked with found out that they were overspending by hundreds of thousands of dollars because the development teams did not turn off the development servers on the weekends. Even though they weren't working on them, they just kept them on. And of course, they were paying for them because they were on. So what they built was a script which shut them down at 8 o'clock on Friday night and spun them up again at 6 o'clock on Monday morning. Saved hundreds of thousands of dollars just by making sure that services were only available when and where they were needed. Okay. I'm not going to go through each of these because they're really just examples. A second benefit of cloud is new business opportunities. We've already mentioned a few of these, but certainly, I mean, your institution may be really good at administration and could start monetizing this by providing it to other schools, for example. Using the cloud. How does ITSM support this? Well, through strategy management, relationship management, service level management, configuration management, understanding what components are needed, and financial management. Already after these two slides, what I'd like to point out is the shift that's happening. The shift is moving in managing cloud services from the more operational side of ITSM, which is incident, problem, change, service catalogs, to service catalogs into service portfolio, service strategy, financial capacity forecasting. These are the more tactical / operational practices that are being used. So you're going to start seeing a shift in ITSM programs to include a lot more emphasis than you already have on how we use capacity management, financial management, because it's different in the cloud than when we do it on-premise. Optimize performance. We achieve this in the cloud by scalable architecture, better redundancy, and immediate commissioning and delivery. You don't have to wait a month for a server. It's there when you need it. Well, how do we support optimized performance? Through availability, security, and capacity management. I included security there, by the way. That can be a bit confusing because why does that optimize? Well, it optimizes because if you don't have it, you find uncontrolled usage of cloud, and you find that you're exposing valuable assets because not everybody in the organization understands how to secure technology-based assets. They may have procured a cloud service themselves without going through IT, and they didn't realize all of the steps that they had to take in order to secure their data. So their performance can quickly become suboptimal because they're dealing with all of these risks and threats. So security provides a counterbalance, which makes sure that you don't overstep in becoming too focused on high performance without the necessary controls in place. So it keeps a balance in your performance, and that's why I included security there. Supplier management, service catalogs, very important. Change and request management, very important, but very different in the cloud, because a lot of the activities in change management shift into the cloud service provider, and you're left with a lot of the more strategic and organizational change activities that are not necessarily done when you're managing in-house. So the challenges. Here's the first one. We have to change the way that IT works. In the cloud, we become customers, and many IT groups are not accustomed to being customers. They want to specify the technology architecture. In the cloud, you don't get to define the technology architecture. You get to define the service architecture. Very different. So you can't ask for sizing information of hardware. They won't give it to you. Your service will specify the performance, and you need to figure out whether that performance is within the range that is acceptable for you. So the roles that we play as IT groups, we're not only a service provider, we'll still continue providing services, but in addition to that, we now have to become a customer, but we also have to become a broker, because we're actually helping the rest of the organization identify which services are going to work for them. That means we have to understand their context better, and we'll also become an intermediary. So we very often are the ones that facilitate the negotiation or discounting structures, or when things go wrong, what do we do between our end users or the cloud consumers and the cloud service provider. So we become that middle office in a very real way. That means, in addition to just pure service management, we need to view ourselves as service integrators. So where we're dealing with multiple service providers, some of them inside the organization, some of them outside the organization. And that requires a very different set of skills to coordinate all of that. Value streams become extremely important because different services contribute to different parts of the value stream. And if we don't know where the value stream is being contributed to, it's very difficult to understand how to manage the service. Just an example on the next slide, we're very good at being able to map value streams because those what services are all about. They depend on value streams, and value streams depend on services. So we map the value stream. We look at where the value is created. That's where the handshakes are, co-created because there are multiple service providers. We quantify what their contribution is at that stage of the value stream, and that's what we manage to. The next thing that is going to become very important to us is the operating model. So we have an operating model in the organization. I'm not just talking about the IT operating model. I'm talking about the way in which your organization works. And we have a cloud technical architecture. Many of the issues with cloud management come from a misalignment between our operating model and what the cloud does. So, it's very often, it's not just lift and shift. When you lift something out of your operating model and automate it in the cloud, it changes things. Behaviors change, the way services are used change, the way you pay for them changes. And so there's a lot of things that change when you start using cloud for your operating model. Understanding that is going to be absolutely key for effective service management. And that will depend on the things in the green box here: architecture, governance, config management, change management, capacity availability management. Again, notice how we're adding layers onto the traditional operational ITSM into those more strategic areas. It's not that they weren't there before, it's that they're now becoming a lot more important and high profile. So we're going to have to put a lot more emphasis on them moving forward. Our responsibilities shift. And this is very difficult for us to figure out. Now, what's interesting here, the orange is what the customer does. The CSP, cloud service provider, does the things in blue. So depending on what model you're using, you will tend to see that vary. What's interesting, though, is this row over here of arrows, service management. Service management is one of those things where it never shifts completely from one organization to another. There will always be components of service management that stay in the consumer organization and some that shift into the cloud service provider, but it's a single practice. That means a huge amount of collaboration required in order to manage the things that we used to take for granted. Allocating incidents, managing problems. In fact, problem management is a very difficult thing for us to get our hands around because we want to have control over problem management. But the cloud service provider says, sorry, but this is not your equipment. It's our problem. It's your incident. So we now have to redefine a relationship between incidents and problems as we move into the cloud. We don't get to sit on their problem management boards. Maybe they sit on ours, but as far as we're concerned, what used to be problems for us are now incidents that are handed off to the service provider. And that takes a lot of acclimatization. Again, we have to start thinking like customers. The next thing we have to be able to do is to measure the value of cloud. It's not just enough to let the business articulate what they think is valuable. Because we're acting as that integrator and that broker, we have to understand what the value is that cloud brings. And in the book, you'll be able to, there are tables and tables that cover this. What are the supported outcomes? What kind of costs get removed? What kind of risks get removed? Versus how do outcomes get negatively impacted? What kind of cost do we introduce when we go to the cloud? And what kind of risk do we introduce? And just for your reference, we've included just some examples of the type of risks, costs, and outcomes, both positive and negative, that can be impacted when we move to the cloud. And that is what we as service managers need to focus on. Brief look at the chat. Thank you. Oh, good. I thought there were questions, but there you go, Mitch. Thank you for those resources. Please check on those. There's some very helpful information in the resources in the links that that Mitch has posted to the chat. Now, what do we do next? Oh, great. Now we know cloud is different and it has the challenges and promises. I'm a service management manager. I am in this situation where we're transitioning from a very traditional data center-based environment to a cloud environment, and I have elements of both that I have to manage. So where do I go from here as a service manager? So please bear in mind, this is not just an IT problem. Okay, cloud is changing the nature of higher ed in general. Right, there are still universities that can afford to take the position. We don't have to worry about these emerging models because we have these great endowments which enable us to continue the traditional education system that we've practiced for decades, if not centuries. But many of you will be in organizations that are under, that are experiencing fierce competition for your student base, and cloud is going to be one of the secrets to how you deal with that and how you provide competitive services. So understand first that as a service manager, it's going to be very important to start understanding what the impact on the business side of the organization is. It's not just an IT problem. The next thing is that governance structures traditionally have emphasized IT as a service provider. We're now going to have to adjust those. We still retain the service provider element, but we're going to have to expand that into more of an integrator and broker / facilitator kind of role. Business models and governance structures are going to change. There is not much that we can do to change that. That ship has sailed. It's on its way. We don't quite know where it's going to end up yet. We do know that ITSM is going to be an absolutely essential part of it, but we also know that there are new approaches coming along that are going to be involved in that as well. We don't quite know how that's going to pan out, but over the next 5 years, we can expect things to change a lot. So be prepared for that, I think. Now, here's 3 actions that can help us deal with this context. First, do a self-check. And the specific things to check for, and this could be individually in your professional growth, or it could be for your IT group as a whole, or it could be within your technology component that is embedded within one of your business units, like research or administration. If you are focused on the things on the left, do a self-check to see just how much focus you have on managing technology services, IT ops, operational ITSM, by which I mean incident, problem, change, to a certain extent, knowledge management, responding to business needs as opposed to collaborating with the business to identify new opportunities, and then defining solutions rather than defining how we take advantage of opportunities. So if you are primarily on the left, no problem with that. But what you're going to find is that your role will continue to move further and further into the technology management space of the organization. You will be increasingly managing individual specialized technologies, and very often those technologies will be moved into the cloud. So you may find your position kind of moving closer and closer into the back office, and then finally, in some cases, working for a cloud service provider. If you want to, you will find that the role of service management can take you in this business-facing direction, or this business-embedded direction, where if you're focused on managing technologies, start thinking about how to focus on value streams. So start developing skills on value stream mapping and how to identify those. Start looking at things like service levels. How do we ensure that the right groups are contributing the right activities and value and performance at the right level in the value stream, right? So those are the kind of things that you start focusing on. If you're focused on IT operations today, what you will find, and I know this is difficult given the governance structures within higher ed, but you will find yourself getting involved in more and more business meetings where you're being asked to advise, we've heard about this new technology. How is that going to impact our ability to reach out to new students, or potentially new students? How can we increase our enrollment speed and accuracy, and so on and so forth? So you will find yourself getting more and more involved in that. And in fact, I'm gonna cover that is one of the additional actions that you can take. I would suggest, if you're not sure where to start, a framework like Sophia, which is the skills framework for the information age, does have a number of very helpful resources which can help you kind of pinpoint some of the skills that are going to be needed as you change some of the focus of your ITSM program. Second concrete action, establish a new forum of communication. Now, this sounds really fancy. What I mean by this is start creating opportunities to have discussions with people in other parts of the organization. Again, I know this is a challenge because governance is so tight within higher ed. It's the same, by the way, in healthcare, right? And I'm currently working in some healthcare organizations. And for an IT person to go and sit down with a physician is very difficult. However, it's not impossible if you go there with the right agenda. So the right agenda is simply asking questions. Tell me about how you work. Tell me what your business priorities are. What risks do you have to manage? What are your biggest concerns and pain points? What changes are you anticipating having to make? How is digital technology impacting the student experience? And I would always start with the friendliest executive you know. And when I say executive, I'm really talking about somebody who is a peer of yours or you can view as a peer. It's always easier to get in that way and start those discussions. Just some guidance for having those discussions. And by the way, I cannot overemphasize the importance of this kind of discussion. It sounds like something very simple and almost trite. Sit down and have coffee with someone. Yeah, really. But realistically, how many times do we do this? And it is so important to building trust and our credibility as we work with them. Some of you may have worked in the organization for years and you have that relationship, great, but many of us don't. Many of us have to build those relationships with new faculty members or new administrative members and so on. So
David,
some guidelines.
We're getting close to the hour.
Okay.
So yeah.
Thanks. I am getting to my last 2 slides. There's some guidelines. Ask questions and listen. Don't try and solve anything. You're not there as a service provider. You're there as a colleague. Ask permission to bring others into a follow-up meeting if it's helpful. And then guide the meeting towards a regular digital transformation agenda. If you don't do that, you'll find that the business groups will not turn to you when there is a digital transformation opportunity. So it's really important to establish that relationship first. And golf, coffee, any of these is a great way to start. The third thing you can do, as I've already hinted at, is to define and review your value streams and start with some simple service mapping or service architecture. Just how do things fit together end to end? You know, how do people use those services in the business environment? And how do we provide them all the way through the service value stream? But there are some, again, those are 3 actions that I think are going to be hugely valuable to you as you move through. And I'm sure many of you are already doing some of these. If that's the case, I just want to encourage you to really formalize and do more of that. If you haven't started doing these, please do. They are hugely valuable and they will, you know, they don't sound like very directly impactful on the whole cloud problem. But believe me, if you don't have those 3 things, it's going to be very difficult to do those things that are more direct and at a later stage. Just some notes. Don't only focus on how digital technology supports ITSM. Focus also on, you know, in other words, oh, we're going to use bots on our service desk. That's great. But self-help actually goes beyond your service desk. It is used in business context. How is that going to help? What is that going to be? This is what ESM is all about. Be open to other frameworks. If you're an ITIL shop, great. But ITIL doesn't have all the answers. If you're a DevOps shop, great. But DevOps doesn't have all the answers. Try and get some input from various sources. Use the best. And please, whatever you do, do not replace basic disciplines with tools. Configuration management is a great example of where you just plug in the discovery tool and it populates your configuration management database. 80% of that data is never used, right? So make sure you have the basic discipline of configuration management. Do not let a tool replace those disciplines for you because the tools don't know the context and they're not intelligent. We are. Conclusion, our role is changing. It is going to be focused more on that business embedded technology, and cloud is one example of where that is happening. We do need more strategic ITSM practices. We have to work with other frameworks. We need to be more business minded than ever before. We have to not only be a service provider, but we have to be an effective consumer. We have to learn how to be that. And we also have to start shifting our roles from being purely a service provider to being a service integrator, broker, and advisor. And I am going to end there by just bringing up a slide with my contact details, if I can get there. So there you are. Please feel free to reach out, even if it's just to discuss, ask questions, etc.
Thank you so much, David. Well, we're at time. If you indulge me for 1 minute, just want to thank David for spending time with us. Thank you for participating in this event. As a reminder, the recording and chat will be sent to you in a few business days. You have David's contact information if you want to contact him. We're always looking for new ideas. If you want to present on a topic, love to have you. Reach out to me and we'll get that set up. And thank you again for attending today, and have a great day. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.